This is one of the world's smallest mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras, but very few people have even heard of it. This is the Samsung NX Mini, and yes, we are talking about the same Samsung that's probably better known these days for making smartphones, TVs and washing machines rather than manufacturing cameras. But between 2010 and 2015, Samsung was actually throwing a lot of money into camera development, and it was actually one of the main players in what was at the time the newly emerging mirrorless camera market. Back then, mirrorless camera technology was the new frontier of photography, and manufacturers were all desperately trying to stake their claim with all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Samsung was no exception, releasing a total of 19 different camera models with their own NX range of cameras, some of which were actually pretty decent. Now, one of the coolest cameras they developed, in my opinion, has to be this NX Mini, because despite its small size, it's actually pretty damn impressive in terms of performance and image quality. But naturally, making a camera this small does mean it has a number of limitations, so why even bother making something this small in the first place? Well, as I've already mentioned, when this camera was developed, mirrorless cameras were still pretty new, and one thing most people liked most about them was just how small they were compared to their larger DSLR counterparts, which at the time was still the go-to option for most photographers. And this sparked somewhat of a gold rush between camera manufacturers all competing to make their own super small yet super capable range of cameras, arguably the most successful of which was Pentax with its Q range of cameras, which quickly developed a cult following. Panasonic also released the Lumix GM1, which I've already talked about on this channel and is actually a pretty impressive little camera. There was also quite infamously the Nikon 1 range of cameras, all of which were super small, but ultimately that range completely flopped for various reasons that I'll no doubt cover in a future video. But the question is, which of these cameras was actually the world's smallest? Well, despite there being lots of debates online, I really couldn't find any official ruling one way or another, because the difference in size between these options is literally just a few millimeters here and there. But although this NX Mini is slightly taller and wider than this Lumix GM1, it certainly takes the accolade for being the lightest mirrorless camera, with the body alone weighing a mere 196 grams, or around 7 ounces, as well as being the thinnest camera with just a thickness of 23 millimeters, which is only slightly thicker than mine. Dictated by this ultra thin profile, Samsung was somewhat limited with the kind of hardware that they could actually fit into this thing, and as a result, the camera only accepts micro SD cards rather than full-size SDs, which ultimately means that the write speed on this camera is somewhat limited. But let's be completely honest, no one is actually buying this camera to rattle off long bursts of images, because where this camera really excels is in situations where you need something powerful yet pocketable for travel and street photography, which is exactly the reason why I decided to take it with me on a recent trip to Calgary in Canada. Seeing as my trip was only for a few days, I didn't have the luxury of taking hold luggage with me, and that meant that I was limited to taking cameras that I could only fit inside my backpack and my coat pocket. Needless to say, this camera absolutely ticks all of the boxes in terms of portability, because this camera and its lenses all travelled with me inside my coat pocket for the entirety of the trip. Now, considering this camera has just turned 10 years old, I was honestly half expecting it to be a little bit slow and sluggish, as older cameras naturally are, but I was actually pretty impressed at just how quickly this camera is able to boot up and shoot on demand. Now, despite the power button being located on the top plate, it's actually quite small and slightly recessed, meaning that you aren't constantly turning it on by accident in your pocket, but it is reachable with your index finger, meaning that you can quickly turn this on with muscle memory. Despite its small size and incredibly thin body, it's actually pretty comfortable to hold, partly due to it having quite a long frame, so there's plenty of room for your fingers to grip onto, even if you do have larger fingers. Although quite subtle, there's also a rear thumb rest that helps to reinforce your grasp, but it also helps to prevent your thumb from accidentally mashing all the buttons in the D-pad below. Speaking of which, there's actually quite a considerate number of shortcut buttons on the back of this camera. Admittedly, they are fairly small and fiddly, and there's no command dial, though luckily the screen on the back is touch sensitive, so I found it much easier just to adjust most of the settings using this, because the settings menu is actually pretty nice to use. Speaking of the rear screen, this is able to actually pull up and rotate 180 degrees, which is obviously designed for vlogging and selfies, but a tilt screen is something that I felt was lacking on the Lumix GM1, particularly considering considering that cameras like this don't have a built-in EVF, so the only thing you're reliant on for composing shots is that rear screen. Now, although there's not enough room to fit a full-sized hot shoe port, there is at least a connection for attaching accessories like a clip-on flash unit. Though to my knowledge, I don't think Samsung ever got as far as developing an external EVF for this camera model, which is a bit of a shame as that would have been a really nice little add-on. Now, because of the smaller sensor size in this camera, Samsung had to develop a brand new lens mount just for this camera model called the NXM mount, which has a grand total of, wait for it, 3 lenses. There's a 9-27mm f3.5 to 5.6, a 9mm f3.5, and a 17mm f1.8 lens, which unfortunately is the only lens from the collection I don't have. But if you did want to expand the lens range for this camera, you can actually buy an adapter that will allow you to use the larger NX mount lenses, which were specifically designed for Samsung's APS-C range of mirrorless cameras. But of the 2 lenses that I own, for the majority of the trip, I found myself favouring this 9mm for a few reasons. Firstly, this is the smallest of the 3 options, and it's enough difference to make this camera slip into your jeans pocket as opposed to always having to go into your coat pocket. Plus, this zoom lens is a little bit on the fiddly side as you do have to unlock it before each use, which makes the whole camera far less reactive when you just need to grab it out of your pocket and take the shot. Plus, after I got back from my trip and started editing the shots I took with this camera, it turns out that the image quality created by the zoom is also pretty crap. The images are very soft with a fair amount of fringing. This 9mm lens in comparison though is infinitely sharper with way less optical issues, so it's a good job that I stuck to this prime lens for 90% of my trip. Now, as I mentioned earlier, unlike Samsung's other mirrorless cameras that all use APS-C size sensors, this camera has a smaller 1-inch sensor, which means that once you factor in the 2.7 times crop, this 9mm lens ends up capturing images that look closer to something like a 24mm lens on a full frame camera. And although 24mm is still pretty wide, it's certainly not as wide as the 9mm focal length leads you to believe. Now, I'll be honest and say that 24mm is a touch wider than what I'm personally used to shooting with, and I kind of wish that I'd forked out for the 17mm lens as well, because this would have been much closer to a 46mm focal length in full frame terms, which is closer to a focal length that I would normally pick for street photography. Plus, this 17mm lens and the zoom both benefit from optical stabilization, whilst this 9mm doesn't have anything like that. And considering that the camera itself lacks any kind of IBIS, I feel that that would have been a nice thing to have. But nonetheless, I still had a lot of fun shooting with this tiny 9mm, and the bright sunny conditions in Canada meant that I still had bags of sharp shots to choose from. Now, we'll obviously come back to talking about image quality in just a moment, but first I want to quickly talk about the autofocus on this camera, because despite the fact that this uses a quite outdated 21-point contrast detect AF, I've got to say it's pretty damn rapid and accurate to focus. In fact, at no point during my trip did I struggle to find focus, so I was overall pretty impressed. Now, with this camera having a flip-up screen, it's pretty obvious that Samsung were targeting vloggers with this camera, and as a result it does have some very basic 1080p video capture functionality, with a dedicated record button located on the rear thumb rest. Now, although the sensor inside this camera is technically smaller than the Lumix GM1 with its 16 megapixel micro four thirds chip, this camera can actually output slightly larger resolution 20.5 megapixel images, and having an extra megapixel or 2 to play around with can certainly come in handy when you need to crop your photos in post. Unfortunately though, unlike the Lumix GM1 and the Pentax Q cameras, there's no mechanical shutter in this camera, so you are stuck with using electronic shutter only, which honestly is a bit of a shame, but kind of to be expected given the super slim profile. Ultimately though, what really matters is the image quality, and I'm pleased to say that the raw files captured by this camera just look great. There's a surprising amount of flexibility in the raw files it captures, meaning that I was able to pull back impressive amounts of detail from the shadows without any noticeable amounts of coloured digital noise, which was an issue I had with the Lumix GM1. Despite this NX Mini developing somewhat of a cult following online, the success was ultimately short-lived because it just simply failed to sell as well as Samsung had initially hoped, meaning that we would never get to see a successor. In fact, shortly after the release of this camera, Samsung decided to just pull out of the mirrorless camera market entirely. These days, with most phone cameras able to offer image quality that's either on par or better than what this can produce, and with an extremely limited range of lenses to choose from, there really isn't a sensible enough reason to ever consider buying one of these cameras, especially as they are fairly rare to find and quite expensive to buy. Just for an example, I actually bought this camera and the 2 lenses I've shown you on eBay for around £500, which is around $630, and for that price there are just way better options to consider. Don't do it! But if you are like me and on occasion you're happy to just throw good sense and reasoning out the window just for the enjoyment and challenge that comes with shooting with a camera like this, then you really won't find many cameras quite as unique and fun to use as the NX Mini.